the issues that brought us to civil war and the issues that some of those issues remain with us. So as we go into the Civil War, remember, it's a power dynamic. It's a power struggle. States' rights versus the Union, the federal government rights. So federal government it provides for the union of the states, and there's this dynamic of that is this power dynamic, really, between states' rights versus federal rights, slave states versus free states. Now, eventually that just, tumbles over and cascades over into war. Now, war and the threat of the Civil War had been brewing, throughout the Manifest Destiny, the Bleeding Kansas, all kinds of things that were happening, and that were happening with new states and extended territories that brought us finally to the inevitable, which was civil war. And some people, I would say that it was inevitable. I can't, looking at all the historical events that led us to that moment, I don't think that it wouldn't not have happened. I don't see how that would have happened. People had very polarizing ideas about their state and their way of life that they could not in any way, shape, or form seem to reevaluate and find compromise, which is very unusual for Americans, because by and large, the whole idea of the way the government was set up, the federal government, was a government that was managed through compromise. Any good marriage, when you get married, you'll find that compromise is the best way of dealing with issues. When you have children, when you are trying to negotiate anything, compromise is really key. People have to give up a little bit of what they want in order to make it work overall. And slavery was an issue where many people did not want to compromise. And now slavery had been going on in the way that we find it in the 1860s for at least 60 years. But remember, we have, at least 1705 was the very first slave codes. So you're looking at really 160 years of the growth of slavery and the growth of the ideology that slavery is good and right, and we're going to rationalize why it's okay to brutalize and demonize Black people. I mean, it's part of the rule of law. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 certainly helps out with that. It's a manifestation of that. And it's also, this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is really also a manifestation of the idea that to be white meant that you had power over anyone who was Black, because in the Fugitive Slave Act, any white person could go up to any Black person and take them and say, this was my slave. And then they could manipulate, even if the Black person was free. They were not necessarily free from becoming a slave. And why? Because a white person said they were not free. And that's a very slippery slope of power differential. And it is inculcated in many ways into the ideas that are behind racism and bigotry. So that's what leads us into the Civil War. Well, the Civil War wasn't just about, you can't say slavery is the only issue here. Slavery is without a doubt the main issue, but slavery and the use of slaves in agriculture, on plantations, or as a labor source is part of a cultural narrative that says that whites are supreme and blacks are slaves. And you're living in an environment, in a cultural and social environment that perpetuates this ideology. And it's that the ideology behind slavery and the allowance of slavery, what perpetuates slavery, is what is at stake in the Civil War as well. It's a war of ideology, a belief that's deep-seated in people in the South. And it's not that the North weren't bigots or racists. People in the North were definitely bigots and racists. But because they lived closer together, their density was higher and their diversity was far more than in the South. Even now, same kind of thing, you have to accept the people you live around, or else you're not going to be able to survive. It isn't a choice so much as it is in the South. And so that's a very that's a real thing. That's a fact that people in the North had to live with much more diversity than in the South. And so while they might not have liked people from different ethnic backgrounds, because that was a very big deal, that bigotry, a very, very big deal in the North, it was, of course, being black in the South. It wasn't so much if you're Irish or what your ethnicity was. If you were white, then you were supreme. So as we enter in the Civil War, we're not just fighting a battle about to secede from the Union, to have a confederacy of Southern states that allows for slavery and the quote-unquote Southern way of life. It is this ideology of, this is how I live, this is what I believe. It's been 150 years in the making, and you're not going to tell me what I can and can't do, the North. You're not going to take away my economic base from me. And that was one of the hardest parts of fighting the war, was that it was a war of ideology. This is my life. This is how I've grown up. This is the way I think, and you're not going to change the way I think. Now, put that aside just for a moment. Put it on a different burner here just for a moment, because concurrently, while people are thinking that in the South, there's another issue at stake here which eventually overrides that ideology, and that is the strategy, the planning, what it is, what does it mean to make war logistically, not just what you think, but how do you make war? And here is where the real trouble laid for the South, in that you've got large masses of people in the North. You've got a much higher population in the North. It was far more densely populated. The North was manufacturing. After the War of 1812, you see the growth of manufacturing. So manufacturing is taking a raw material and making it into a usable good. So they have supplies. They have the ability not only to make supplies, but make supplies in great numbers to be able to meet the needs of the Union Army. There's food, there's supplies, they have all these things that the Southerners did not have over the long haul. The South, they had a lot of ambition, they had a lot of gumption, they wanted to fight for their beliefs, but they didn't have as many men to fight. They didn't have a supply chain that was as organized and structured as the North. They were agriculturally based, as you know, and so what their specialty was making the raw materials that would then be shipped to the north or shipped to Europe to be manufactured. So they're inherent in the way their economy was based. They didn't have the means by which to keep a war going for very long. And slowly but surely, as their men died, they didn't have a lot of replacements. And by the time we get to 1864, there are two things that we see changing. And one is that the Confederate Army is bringing in younger, almost boys, 14 years old, 13, 14, 15. And you also see ex-slaves or slaves joining the fight. Like there is a black contingent in the Confederate Army at the very, very end. In the North, we have black soldiers eventually, but they're made up of freedmen, or they're made up of ex-slaves who fled the South, more likely Maryland, which was a border state, and were able to join the Northern Army. But even in the South, there is a black contingency of soldiers at the very, very end because they just don't have the manpower. So logistically, these in the South didn't have the means by which to maintain a long, drawn-out war, but they're fighting ideology. They want to maintain their Southern way of life, and that ideology will overshadow any logistical issues. This is how I believe, and it takes a change in your mind. You have to. It's like it's a, I don't know, like a lightning bolt. I don't know exactly what it is, but to change your mind from going from an ideology to recognize the hopelessness of where you are. It's a very big deal, and it takes a lot to see it and to accept it. And many of the Southerners did not see that or want to accept that. And the only way in the end that they really did accept that was by the North winning so many battles. So Grant really made huge inroads in winning battles for the Union. And then Sherman came in with a concept called total war. Now, this concept of war strategy is being taught in military academies across the world. And this concept of total war is really in addressing the war of ideology. It's one way of addressing it. And in the fall of 1864, Sherman just plowed through the South and just burned the South and went all the way through Georgia to Savannah, Georgia, and got to the Savannah, Georgia, and sent a telegram on Christmas Day to President Lincoln saying, "I have a Christmas present for you, and that is Savannah, Georgia." And to this day, you can go to the graveyard in Savannah, Georgia. There's a graveyard there where you can still see where headstones were moved by the Union Army at that time. So it was really decimated. It burned plantations to the ground. There's a whole swath of Georgia that was completely burned to the ground. And that is an event that just smacks you in the face and forces you to see the ruination of your world. And that's what Sherman wanted. Really trauma to these people, to shut them down and make them stop making war. And it did. It brought the Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his contingent to meet with Abraham Lincoln when Abraham Lincoln was reelected, and when he was in the first months of his second term, he had the Southern contingent that represented the Confederacy basically on a ship, uh, waiting to create a peace treaty and be welcomed back into the Union outside of Washington. At the same time, concurrently, while Abraham Lincoln was working with the Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. So why was that important? So it was important because President Lincoln created this executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. It freed slaves in border states, but it didn't really free the slaves. It was an executive order under a time of war, and he knew that the executive orders are not rules of law. So if he made peace with the Confederates, then nothing would have changed because they would have insisted on keeping slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation it was not law. So what are they fighting? What did they fight for the last 4 years? Brutal fighting, killing so many men. What was it all for if you don't free the slaves? So the only way to truly free the slaves was to do it through the rule of law. And Lincoln worked furiously during the first month of his re-election in his second term to pass the 13th Amendment. And it did. In March of 1865, he passed the 13th Amendment. And now, after the 13th Amendment was passed and the rule of law was in place, that all slaves were free, because that's what it did, then he had a conversation. Then he was able to bring peace to the South. And he didn't, because they're Southerners and they're Americans, he did not want to bring them back in. He wanted to bring them back in with open arms. You are our brethren. You are our countrymen. And the issue that was at stake here that we fought this brutal war over is no longer an issue. And so, and of course there were issues, maybe it was under rule of law, as we all know, but that doesn't mean it changes people's minds. So if you have slavery in the concept that people who are black are less than you, and if you are white and you have supremacy over the laws and you are the leaders and you make all the rules, you think that's going to change with a law? No way is it going to change with a law. And we still see this going forward. And next week in Reconstruction, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But this war really was a huge event in the history of this country. Some people say it was our second independence. I think your textbook writes about that. Most people all will agree that this was inevitable. When the founders came together to create the Constitution, they needed everybody on board to create a sovereign nation. And so they put slavery to the side because they knew they were not going to get votes from the South if slavery was banned. Or outlawed. And so they picked their battles. And then in the Civil War is when we really fought that battle. Although, having said that, have we really finished fighting that battle? I would say no. I would say that we are still very much part of fighting that battle, even now. And I think we need to, evaluate what these men died for, both on the Union and the Confederacy side. I also hope that you guys will watch. There's a link to it. It's called the Ken Burns, the Civil War series, and it was from a book written by a historian named Shelby Foote. And Shelby Foote created a 5-volume series on the Civil War. That's what it's titled. And he did a wonderful, wonderful job on it. It's a narrative. It's not like reading a history book, one of your textbooks. It's a really interesting series of books that Ken Burns then made into a documentary series. There's a link to the first video of that series, and I want you all to watch that. I think it would be very interesting if you did. If we were in class, we would be watching it. It really goes through a lot of information. There's Frederick Douglass. There's Mary Chestnut. People who had diaries and who journaled the war from their perspective. And it's very interesting to listen to these different perspectives. You know, history is usually written by the victors, and by and large, the Civil War was taught that way. If you were in the South, when you were young, you know, in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, what you would have read about the Civil War is that it would not have been called the Civil War. It would have been called the War of Northern Aggression. The War of Northern Aggression. And inherent in the way that is titled, it's pitted, the South is pitted against the North. Still, this, 100 years after the Civil War was over, people were still being taught in the South about the Civil War as Northern aggression, not from the perspective of what it really was. So it was a bias, a confirmation bias, or a narrative that they held about this Southern way of life, this belief in this Southern way of life that the North encroached on and tried to destroy. And so that war of ideology that Sherman tried to fight really didn't work. In the North, it was taught the Civil War. It wasn't taught negative. It didn't have the same negative connotations, but that's because the South was angry, and so their narrative in their textbooks was a reflection of that anger that still exists even today. But with the Civil War video by Ken Burns and through Shelby Foote, you don't see just the victors. What you see are personal journals, personal descriptions of the war, of the way people saw it, what they were seeing in the streets, what they were dealing with. These are really individual evaluations and observations that I think is important to really understand the magnitude of what the Civil War was about, and why even now, in the year 2020, in the 21st century, we see the perpetuation of the concepts of white supremacy, or of institutionalized racism, or where we see Ava DuVernay and her documentary, The 13th. There's a lot of things that we are still addressing now, because it is very hard to fight a war on ideology. And if one side loses, then those who remain, that bitterness and that anger still remains. And here we are, so far in the future from when this event happened, and yet we are still mired with similar fights, similar arguments, similar issues that were present prior to, during, and the Civil War. So it's something I think to ponder on. I think it's something we should all be thinking about. And no matter what your feelings are about this, I want you to, I would like you to watch the first, it will be in, it's in Blackboard, this very first episode of the Civil War documentary. And I just want you to think about it. I want you to think about it in conjunction with the issues that we face today. Okay? So that's it for this lecture, mini lecture. Sputnik is saying goodbye in his sleep here. And, oh, he's moving. And I hope you guys have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your families. And I will look forward to seeing you next week and looking at your presentations. Okay? Don't forget to load them up. I miss you. Love you, mean it. And if you need me, all you have to do is email. All right? Okie dokie. Bye.